Chapter 30 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As Arizona had predicted, Sheriff Kern was greatly tempted not to start on the hard ride for the mountains before morning, and finally he followed his impulse. With the first break of the dawn he was up, and a few minutes later he had taken the trail alone. There was no need for numbers, for that matter, to tell a single man that he no longer needed dread the law. But it was only common decency to inform him of the charge, and Kern was a decent sort. He was thoughtful on the trail. A great many things had happened to upset the sheriff. The capture of Sinclair, taken all in all, was an important event. To be sure, the chief glory was attributable to the cunning of Arizona. Nevertheless, the community was sure to pay homage to the skill of the sheriff who had led the party and managed the capture. But now the sheriff found himself regretting the capture and all its attendant glory. Not even a personal grudge against the man who had taken his first prisoner from him could give an edge to the sheriff's satisfaction, for during the late hours of the preceding night he had heard from Sinclair the true story of the killing of Quade, not a murder, but a fair fight. And he had heard more, the whole unhappy tale which began with the death of Hal Sinclair in the desert, a story which now included, so far as the sheriff knew, 3 deaths with a promise of another in the future. It was little wonder that he was disturbed. His philosophy was of the kind that is built up in a country of horses, hard riding, hard work, hard fighting. According to the precepts of that philosophy, Sinclair would have shirked the vital moral duty had he failed to avenge the pitiful death of his brother. The sheriff put himself into the boots of the man who was now his prisoner and facing a sentence of death. In that man's place, he knew that he would have taken the same course. It was a matter of necessary principle, and the sheriff also knew that no jury in the country could allow Sinclair to go free. It might not be a death sentence, but it would certainly be a prison term as bad as death. These thoughts consumed the time of the sheriff until his horse had labored up the height, and he came to the little plateau where so much had happened outside of his ken. And there he saw Bill Sanderson, with the all-seeing sun on his dead eyes. For a moment, the sheriff could not believe what he saw. Sanderson was, in the phrase of the land, Sinclair's meat. It suddenly seemed to him that Sinclair must have broken from jail and done this killing during the night. But a moment's reflection assured him that this could not be. The mind of the sheriff whirled. Not Sinclair, certainly. The man had been dead for some hours. In the sky far above and to the north, there were certain black specks moving in great circles that drifted gradually south. The buzzards were already coming to the dead. He watched them for a moment with the sinking of the heart which always comes to the man of the mountain desert when he sees those grim birds. It was not Sinclair. But who then? He examined the body and the wound. It was a center shot, nicely placed. Certainly not the sort of shot that Cold Feet, according to the description which Sinclair had given of the latter's marksmanship, would have been apt to make. But there was no other conclusion to come to. Cold Feet had certainly been here, according to Sinclair's confession, and it was certainly reasonable to suppose that Cold Feet had committed this crime. The sheriff placed the hat of Sinclair over his face and swung back into his saddle. He must hurry back to Sour Creek and send up a burial party, for no one would have an interest in interring the body in the town. But once in the saddle, he paused again. The thought of the schoolteacher having killed so formidable a fighter as Sanderson stuck in his mind as a thing too contrary to probability. Moreover, the sheriff had grown extremely cautious. He had made one great failure very recently, the escape of this same Cold Feet. He would have failed again had it not been for Arizona. He shuddered at the thought of how his reputation would have been ruined had he gone on the trail and allowed Sinclair to double back to Sour Creek and take the town by surprise. Dismounting, he threw his reins and went back to review the scene of the killing. There were plenty of tracks around the place. The gravel obscured a great part of the marks, and still other prints were blurred by the dead grass. But there were pockets of rich, loamy soil, moist enough and firm enough to take an impression as clearly as paper takes ink. The sheriff removed the right shoe from the foot of Sanderson and made a series of fresh prints. They were quite distinctive. The heel was turned out to such an extent that the track was always a narrow indentation, where the heel fell on the soft soil. He identified the same tracks in many places, and dismissing the other tracks, the sheriff proceeded to make up a trail history for Sanderson. He came up the hill on foot. Here he paused beside the embers of the fire and remained standing for a long time, for the marks were worked in deeply. After a time the trail went. He followed it with difficulty over the hard-packed gravel, up the side of the hill to a semicircular arrangement of rocks, and there, distinct in the soil, was the impression of the body where the cowpuncher had lain down. The sheriff lay down in turn, and at once he was sure why Sanderson had chosen this spot. He was defended perfectly on three sides from bullets, and in the meantime, through crevices in the rock, he maintained a clear outlook over the whole side of the hill. Obviously, Sanderson had lain down to keep watch. For what? For Cold Feet, of course, on whose head a price rested, or at least, so Sinclair must have believed at the time. The news had not yet been published abroad that Cold Feet had been exculpated by the confession of Sinclair to the killing of Quade. So much was clear, but presently Sanderson had risen and gone down the hill again, leaving from the other side of the rock. Had he covered Cold Feet when the latter returned to his camp, having been absent when Sanderson first arrived? No, the tracks down the hill were leisurely, not the long strides which a man would make to get close to one whom he had covered with a revolver from a distance. Reaching the shoulder of the mountain, Kern puzzled anew. He began a fresh study of the tracks. Those of Cold Feet were instantly known by the tiny size of the marks of the soles. The sheriff remembered that he had often wondered at the smallness of the schoolteacher's feet. Cold Feet was there, and Sanderson was dead. Again it seemed certain that Cold Feet had been guilty of the crime. But the sheriff kept on systematically hunting for new evidence. He found no third set of tracks for some time. But when he did find them, they were very clear. A short, broad foot, the imprint of a heavy man. A fat man, then, no doubt. From the length of the footprint, it was very doubtful if the man were tall, and certainly, by the clearness of the indentation, the man was heavy. The sheriff could tell by making a track beside that of the quarry. A second possibility, therefore, had entered, and the sheriff felt a reasonable conviction that this must be the guilty man. Now he combed the whole area for some means of identifying the third man who had been on the mountainside. But nothing had been dropped except a brilliant bandana, wadded compactly together, which the sheriff recognized as belonging to Sanderson. There was only one definite means of recognizing the third man. Very faint in the center of the impression made by his sole were two crossed arrows, the sign of the bootmaker. The sheriff shook his head. Could he examine the soles of the boots of every man in the vicinity of Sour Creek, even if he limited his inquiry to those who were short and stocky? And might not there be many a man who wore the same type of boots? He flung himself gloomily into his saddle again, and this time he headed straight down the trail for Sour Creek. At the hotel he was surrounded by an excited knot of people who wished to know how he had extracted the amazing confession from Riley Sinclair. The sheriff tore himself away from a dozen hands who wished to buttonhole him in close conversation. "I tell you gents this," he said. "Quade was killed because he needed killing, and Sinclair confessed because he's straight." With that, casting an ugly glance at the lot of them, he went back into the kitchen and demanded a cup of coffee. The Chinese cook obeyed the order in a hurry, highly flattered and not a little nervous at the presence of the great man in the kitchen. While Kern was there, Arizona entered. The sheriff greeted him cheerfully, with his coffee cup balanced in one hand. "Arizona," he said, "or Dago, or whatever you like to be called." "Cut the Dago part, will you?" demanded Arizona. "I ain't no ways wishing to be reminded of that name. Nobody calls me that." Kern grinned covertly. "I suppose," said Arizona slowly, "that you and Sinclair had a long yarn about when he knew me some time back." The sheriff shook his head. "Between you and me," he said frankly, "it sounded to me like Sinclair knew something you mightn't want to have noised around. Is that straight?" "I'll tell you," answered the other. "When I was a kid, I was a fool kid. That's all it amounts to." Sheriff Kern grunted. "All right, Arizona, I ain't asking. But you can lay to it that Sinclair won't talk. He's as straight as I ever seen." "Maybe," said Arizona, "but he's slippery. And I got this to say. Let me have the watch over Sinclair while he's in Sour Creek, or are you taking him back to Woodville today?" "I'm held over," said the sheriff. He paused. Twice the little olive-skinned man from the South had demonstrated his superiority in working out criminal puzzles. The sheriff was prone to unravel the new mystery by himself, if he might. "By what?" "Oh, by something I'll tell you about later on," said the sheriff. "It don't amount to much, but I want to look into it." Purposely, he had delayed sending a party to bury Sanderson. It would be simply warning the murderer if that man were in Sour Creek. "About you and Sinclair," went on the sheriff. "There ain't much good feeling between you, eh?" "I won't shoot him in the back if I guard him," declared Arizona. "But if you want one of the other boys to take the jog, go ahead. Put Red on it." "He's too young. Sinclair gets him off guard by talking." "Then try Wood." "Wood ain't his best off the trail. Come to think about it, I'd rather trust Sinclair to you, that is, if you make up your mind to treat him square." "Sheriff, I'll give him a squarer deal than you think." Kern nodded. "More coffee, Lee," he called. Lee obeyed with such haste that he overbrimmed the cup, and some of the liquid washed out of the saucer onto the floor. "Coming back to shop talk," went on the sheriff, as Lee mopped up the spilled coffee, mumbling excuses. "I ain't had a real chance to tell you what a fine job you done for us last night, Arizona." Arizona, with due modesty, waved the praise away and stepped to the container of matches hanging beside the stove. He came back lighting a cigarette and contentedly puffed out a great cloud. "Forget all that stuff, Sheriff, will you?" "Not if I live to be 100, answered the sheriff with frank admiration. So saying, his eyes dropped to the floor and remained there riveted. The foot of Arizona had rested on the spot where the coffee had fallen. The print was clearly marked with dust, except that in the center, where the sole had lain, there was a sharply defined pair of crossed arrows. A short, fat, heavy man. The sheriff raised his glance and examined the bulky shoulders of the man. Then he hastily swallowed the rest of his coffee. Yet there might be a dozen other short, stocky men in town whose boots had the same impression. He looked thoughtfully out the kitchen window, striving to remember some clue. But as far as he could make out, the only time Arizona and Sanderson had crossed had been when the latter applied for a place on the posse. Surely a small thing to make a man commit a murder. "If you give me the job of guarding Sinclair," said Arizona, "I'd sure—" "Wait a minute," cut in the sheriff. "I'll be back right away. I think that was Mackenzie who went into the stable. Don't leave until I come back, Arizona." Hurriedly he went out. There was no Mackenzie in the stable, and the sheriff did not look for one. He went straight to Arizona's horse. The roan was perfectly dry, but examining the hide, the sheriff saw that the horse had been recently groomed, and a thorough grooming would soon dry the hair and remove all traces of a long ride. Stepping back to the peg from which the saddle hung, he raised the stirrup leather. On the inside, where the leather had chafed the side of the horse, there was a dirty gray coating, the accumulation of the dust and sweat of many a ride. But it was soft with recent sweat, and along the edges of the leather there was a barely dried line of foam that rubbed away readily under the touch of his fingertip. Next, he examined the bridle. There also were similar evidences of recent riding. The sheriff returned calmly to the kitchen of the hotel. "And your mind's made up?" asked Arizona. "Yes," said the sheriff. "You go in with Sinclair." "Go in with him?" asked Arizona, baffled. "For murder," said the sheriff. "Stick up your hands, Arizona." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Even though he was taken utterly by surprise, habit made Arizona go for his own gun, as the sheriff whipped out his weapon. But under those conditions he was beaten badly to the draw. Before his weapon was half out of the holster, the sheriff had the drop. Arizona paused, but for a moment his eyes fought Kern, figuring chances. It was only the hesitation of an instant. The battle was lost before it had begun, and Arizona was clever enough to know it. Swiftly he turned on a new tack. He shoved his revolver back into the holster and smiled benevolently on the sheriff. "What's the new game, Kern?" "It ain't new," said the sheriff joylessly. "It's about the oldest game in the world, Arizona. You sure killed Sanderson." "Sanderson?" Arizona laughed. "Why, man, I ain't hardly seen him more than once. How come that I would kill him?" "Get your hands up, Arizona." "Oh, sure," he obeyed with apparent willingness. "But don't let anybody see you making this fool play, Sheriff." "Maybe not so foolish. I'll tell you why you killed him. You're broke, Arizona. 10 days ago, Mississippi Slim cleaned you out at dice. Well, when Sinclair told me where Cold Feet was, you listened through the door, but you didn't stay to find out that Jig wasn't wanted no more. You beat it up to the mountain, and there you found Sanderson was ahead of your time. You drilled Sanderson, hoping to throw the blame on Cold Feet. Then you come down, but on the way Cold Feet gives you the slip and gets away, and that's why you are here." Arizona blinked. So much of this tale was true that it shook even his iron nerve. He managed a smile. "That's a wild yarn, Sheriff. Do you think it'll go down with a jury?" "It'll go down with any jury around these parts. What's more, Arizona, I ain't going to rest on what I think. I'm going to find out. And if I send down to the south inquiring about you, I got an idea that I'll find out enough to hang 10 like you, huh?" Once more Arizona received the vital blow, and he winced under the impact. Moreover, he was bewildered. His own superior intelligence had inclined him to despise the sheriff, whom he put down as a fellow of more bulldog power than mental agility. All in a moment it was being borne in upon him that he had underrated his man. He could not answer. His smooth tongue was chained. "Not that I got any personal grudge against you," went on the sheriff, "but it's gents like you that I'm after, Arizona, not ones like Sinclair. You ain't clean, Arizona. You're slick, and there ain't elbow room enough in the West for slick gents. Besides, you've got a bad way with your gun. I can tell you this, speaking private and confidential, I'm going to hang you, Arizona, if there's any way possible." He said all this quietly, but the revolver remained poised with rock-like firmness. He drew out a pair of manacles. "Stand up, Arizona." Listlessly, the fat man got up. He had been changing singularly during the last speech of the sheriff. Now he dropped a hand on the edge of the table, as if to support himself. The sheriff saw the hand grip the wood until the knuckles went white. Arizona moistened his colorless lips. "Not the irons, Sheriff," he said softly. "Not them." If it had been any other man, Kern would have imagined that he was losing his nerve. But he knew Arizona, had seen him in action, and he was certain that his courage was above question. Consequently, he was amazed. As certainly as he had ever seen them exposed, these were the horrible symptoms of cowardice that make a brave man shudder to see. "Can't trust you," he said wonderingly. "Wouldn't trust you a minute, Arizona, without the irons on you. You're a bad actor, son, and I've seen you acting up. Don't forget that." "Sheriff, I give you my word that I'll go quiet as a lamb." A moment elapsed before Kern could answer, for the voice of Arizona had trembled as he spoke. The sheriff could not believe his ears. "Well, I'm sorry, Arizona," he said more gently, because he was striving to banish this disgusting suspicion from his own mind. "I can't take no chances. Just turn around, will you, and keep them hands up." He barked the last words, for the arms of Arizona had crooked suddenly. They stiffened at the sharp command of the sheriff. Slowly trembling, as if they possessed a volition of their own, hardly controlled by the fat man, those hands fought their way back to their former position. And then Arizona gradually turned his back on the sheriff. A convulsive shudder ran through him as Kern removed his gun, and then seized one of the raised hands, drew it down, and fastened one part of the iron on it. The other hand followed, and as the sheriff snapped the lock, he saw a singular transformation in the figure of his captive. The shoulders of Arizona slouched forward. His head sank. From the erect, powerful figure of a moment before, he became, in comparison, a flabby pile of flesh, animated by no will. "What's the matter?" asked the sheriff. "You ain't lost your nerve, have you, fatty?" Arizona did not answer. Kern stepped to one side and glanced at the face of his captive. It was strangely altered. The mouth had become trembling, loose, uncertain. The head had fallen, and the bright, keen eyes were dull. The man looked up with darting side glances. The sheriff stood back and wiped the sudden perspiration from his forehead. Under his very eyes the spirit of this gunfighter was disintegrating. The sheriff felt a cold shame pour through him. He wanted to hide this man from the eyes of others. It was not right that he should be seen. His weakness was written too patently. Kern was no psychologist, but he knew that some men out of their peculiar element are like fish out of water. He shook his head. "Walk out that back door, will you?" he asked softly. "We ain't going down the street?" demanded Arizona. "No." "Thanks, Sheriff." Again Kern shuddered, swallowed, and then commanded, "Start along, Arizona." Slinking through the door, the fat man hesitated on the little porch and cast a quick glance up and down. "No one near," he said. "Hurry up, Sheriff." Quickly they skirted down behind the houses, not unseen, however. A small boy playing behind his father's house raised his head to watch the hurrying pair, and when he saw the glitter of the irons, they heard him gasp. He was old enough to know the meaning of that. Irons on Arizona, who had been a town hero the night before. They saw the youngster dart around the house. "Blast him," groaned Arizona. "He'll spread it everywhere. Hurry." He was right. The sheriff hurried with a will, but as they crossed the street for the door of the jail, voices blew down to them. Looking toward the hotel, they saw men pouring out into the street, pointing, shouting to one another. They swept down on the pair. But the sheriff and his prisoner gained the door of the jail first, and Kern locked it behind him. His deputy on guard rose with a start, and at the same time there was a hurried knocking on the door and a clamor of voices without. Arizona shrank away from that sound, scowling over his shoulder, but the sheriff nodded good-humoredly. "Take it easy, Arizona. I ain't going to make a show of you." "Sure, that's like you, Sheriff," said a hurried, half-whining voice. "You're square. I'll sure show you one of these days. Now, I appreciate the way you treat me." Kern was staggered. It seemed to him that a new personality had taken possession of the body of the fat man. He led the way past his gaping deputy. The jail was not constructed for a crowd. It was merely a temporary abiding place before prisoners were taken to the larger institution at Woodville. Consequently, there was only one big cell. The sheriff unlocked the door, slipped the manacles from the wrists of Arizona, and jabbed the muzzle of a revolver into his back. The last act was decidedly necessary, for the moment his wrists were released from the grip of the steel, Arizona twitched halfway round toward the sheriff. The scrape of the gun muzzle against his ribs, however, convinced him. Over his shoulder, he cast one murderous glance at the sheriff and then slouched forward into the cell. "Company for you, Riley," said the sheriff, as the tall cowpuncher rose. The other's back was turned, and thereby the sheriff was enabled to pass a significant gesture and look to Sinclair. With that, he left them. In the outer room, he found his deputy much alarmed. "You ain't turned them two in together?" he asked. "Why, Sinclair'll kill that gent in about a minute. Ain't it Arizona that nailed him?" "Sinclair will play square," Kern insisted, "and Arizona won't fight." Leaving the other to digest these mysterious tidings, the sheriff went out to disperse the crowd. In the meantime, Sinclair had received the newcomer in perfect silence, his head raised high, his thin mouth set in an ugly line, very much as an eagle might receive an owl which floundered by mistake onto the same crag, far above his element. The eagle hesitated between scorn of the visitor and a faint desire to pounce on him and rend him to pieces. That glittering eye, however, was soon dull with wonder when he watched the actions of Arizona. The fat man paused in the center of the cell, regarded Sinclair with a single flash of the eyes, and then glanced uneasily from side to side. That done, he slipped away to a corner and slouched down on a stool, his head bent down on his breast. Apparently, he had fallen into a profound reverie, but Sinclair found that the eyes of Arizona continually whipped up and across to him. Once the newcomer shifted his position a little, and Sinclair saw him test the weight of the stool beneath him with his hand. Even in the cell, Arizona had found a weapon. Gradually, Sinclair understood the meaning of that glance and the gesture of the sheriff as the latter left. He read other things in the gray pallor of Arizona and in the fallen head. The man was unnerved. Sinclair's reaction was very much what that of the sheriff had been, a sinking of the heart and a momentary doubt of himself. But he was something more of a philosopher than Kern. He had seen more of life and men and put two and two together. One thing stared him plainly in the face. The Arizona who skulked in the corner had relapsed 8 years. He was the same sneak thief whom Sinclair had first met in the lumber camp, and he knew instinctively that this was the first time since that unpleasant episode that Arizona had been cornered. The loathing left Sinclair, and in its place came pity. He had no fondness of Arizona, but he had seen him in the role of a strong man, which made the contrast more awful. It reminded Sinclair of the wild horse which loses its spirit when it is broken. Such was Arizona. Free to come and go, he had been a danger. Shut up helplessly in a cell, he was as feeble as a child, and his only strength was a sort of cunning malice. Sinclair turned quietly to the fat man. "Arizona," he said, "you look sort of underfed today. Bring your stool a bit nearer and let's talk. I've been hungry for a chat with someone." In reply, Arizona rolled back his head and for a moment glared thoughtfully at Sinclair. He made no answer. Presently his glance fell, like that of a dog. Sinclair shivered. He tried brutality. "Looks to me, Arizona, as though you've lost your nerve." The other moistened his lips, but said nothing. "But the point is," said the tall cowpuncher, "that you've given up before you're beaten." Riley Sinclair's words brought a flash from Arizona, a sudden lifting up of the head, as if he had not before thought of hoping. Then he began to slump back into his former position, without a reply. Sinclair followed his opening advantage at once. "What you in for?" "Murder." "Great guns! Of whom?" "Sanderson." It brought Sinclair stiffly to his feet. Sanderson? His trail was ended. Hal was avenged at last. "And you done it? Fatty, you took that job out of my hands. I'm thanking you. Besides, it ain't nothing to be downhearted about. Sanderson was a skunk. Can they prove it on you?" The need to talk overwhelmed Arizona. It burst out of him, not to Sinclair, but rather at him. His shifting eyes made sure there was no one near. "Kern is going to send south for the dope. I'm done for. They can hang me 3 times on what they'll learn, and..." "Shut up," snapped Sinclair. "Don't talk foolish. The South is a tolerable big place to send to. They don't know where you come from. Take 'em a month to find out, and by that time you won't be at hand." "Eh?" "Because you and me are going to bust out of this paper jail they've got." He had not the slightest hope of escape, but he tried the experiment of that suggestion merely to see what the fat man's reactions would be. The result was more than he could have dreamed. Arizona whirled on him with eyes ablaze. "What do you mean, Sinclair?" "Just what I say. Do you think they can keep 2 like us in here? No, not if you come to your old self." The need to confide again fell on Arizona. He dragged the stool nearer. His voice was a whisper. "Sinclair, something's busted in me. When them irons grabbed my arms, they took everything out of me. I got no chance. They got me cornered." "And you'll fight like a wildcat to the end of things." "Sure you will. Buck up, man. You think you've turned yellow. You ain't. You're just out of place. Take a gent that's used to a 40-foot rope and a pony, give him 60 feet on a 16-hand horse, and ain't he out of place? Sure, he looks like a clumsy fool. And the other way around it works the same way. A trout may be a flash of light in water, but on dry land he ain't worth a damn. Same with you, Fatty. While you got a free foot, you're all right. But when they put you behind a wall and saying they're going to keep you there, you're darn near bust down. Why? Because it looks to you like you ain't got a chance to fight back. So you quit altogether. But you'll come back to yourself, Arizona. You..." Arizona raised his hand. He was sitting erect now, drinking in the words of Sinclair as if they were air to a stifling man. His face worked. "Why are you doing this for me, Sinclair, after I landed you here?" "Because I made a man out of you once," answered the tall man evenly, "and I ain't going to see you backslide. Why, Arizona, you're one of the fastest thinking, quickest handed gents that ever buckled on a gun. And here you are lying down like a kid It ain't never faced trouble before. Come alive, man. You and me are going to bust this old jail to smithereens. And when we get outside, I'll blow your head off if I can." Riley's words had carried Arizona with him. Suddenly, an olive-skinned hand shot out and clutched his own bony, strong fingers. The hand was fat and cold, but it gripped that of Riley Sinclair with a desperate energy. "Sinclair, you mean it? You'll play in with me?" "I will, sure." He had to drag the words out, but after he had spoken he was glad. New life shone in the face of Arizona. "A man with you for a partner ain't done, Sinclair. Not if he had a rope around his neck. Listen, do you know why I come in town?" "Well?" "To get you out." "I believe you, Arizona," lied Sinclair. "Not for your sake, but hers." Sinclair's face suddenly went white. "Who?" "The girl," whispered Arizona. "I cached her away outside of town to wait for us. Sinclair, she loves you." Riley Sinclair sat as one stunned and dragged the hat from his head. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Through the branches of the copse in which she was hiding, the girl saw the sun descend in the west, a streak of slowly dropping fire, and now she became excited. "As soon as it's dark," Arizona had promised, "I'll make my start. Have your horse ready, be in the saddle, and the minute you see us come down that trail out of Sour Creek, be ready to feed your horse the spur and join us, because when we come, we'll come fast. Don't make no mistake. If you ride too slow, we'll have to ride slow, too. And slow riding means gunplay on both sides, and gunplay means dead men, because the evening is a pile worse nor the dark for fooling a man's aim. You'll see me and Sinclair scoot along that there road, with the gang yelling behind us." Having made this farewell speech, he waved his hand and, with a smile of confidence, jogged away from her. It was the beginning of a dull day of waiting for her, yet a day in which she dared not altogether relax her vigilance, because at any time the break might come, and Arizona might appear flying down the trail with the familiar tall form of Sinclair beside him. Wearily, she waited until sundown. With the coming of dusk, she wakened suddenly and became tinglingly alert. The night spread rapidly down out of the mountains. The color faded, and the sudden chill of the high altitude settled about her. Her hands and her feet were cold with the fear of excitement. Into the gathering gloom she strained her eyes. Toward Sour Creek she strained her ears, staring at every faint sound of a man's shout or the barking of a dog, as if this might be the beginning of the uproar that would announce the escape. Something swung onto the road out of the end of the main street. She was instantly in the saddle, but by the time she reached the edge of the copse, she found it to be only a wagon filled with singing men going back to some nearby ranch. Then quiet dropped over the valley, and she became aware that it was the utter dark. Arizona had failed. That knowledge grew more surely upon her with every moment. His intention must have been guessed, for she could not imagine that slippery and cold-minded fellow being thwarted, if he were left free to work as he pleased toward an object he desired. She could not stay in the grove all night. Besides, this was the critical time for Riley Sinclair. Tomorrow he would be taken to the security of the Woodville jail, and the end would be close. If anything were done for him, it must be done before morning. With the thought in mind, she rode boldly out of the trees and took the road into town, where the lights of the early evening had turned from white to yellow as the night deepened. Sour Creek was hardly a mile away when a rattling in the dark announced the approach of a buckboard. She drew rein at the side of the trail. Suddenly, the wagon loomed out at her, with two down-headed horses jogging along and the loose reins swinging above their backs. "Hello," called Jig. The brakes ground against the wheels, squeaking in protest. The horses came to a halt so willingly and suddenly that the collars shoved halfway up their necks, and the tongue of the wagon lurched beyond their noses. "Whoa! Evening there. You kind of give me a start, stranger." Parroting the dialect as well as she was able, Jig said, "Sorry, stranger. Might that be Sour Creek?" "It sure might be," said the driver, leaning through the dark to make out Jig. "New in these parts?" "Yep. I'm over from Whiteacre way, and I'm aiming for Woodville." "Whiteacre? Doggone me if it ain't good to meet a Whiteacre boy. I was raised there, son. Joe Lunids is my name." "I'm Texas Lou," said the girl. There was a subdued chuckle from the darkness. "You sound kind of young for a name like that, kid. Leastwise, your voice is tolerable young." "I'm old enough," said Jig aggressively. Sure," placated the other. "Sure you are." "Besides," she went on, "I wanted a name that I could grow up to." It brought a hearty burst of laughter from the wagon. "That's a good one, Texas. Have a drink." She set her teeth over the refusal that had come to her lips, and reining near, reached out for the flask. The driver passed over the bottle, and at the same time lighted a match for the apparent purpose of starting a cigarette. But Jiggs nodded her head in time to obscure her face with the flopping brim of her sombrero. The other coughed in his disappointment. She raised the bottle after uncorking it, firmly securing the neck with her thumb. After a moment she lowered it, and sighed with satisfaction as she had heard men do. "Thanks," said Jiggs, handing back the flask. "Hot stuff, partner." "You got a tough throat," observed the rancher. "First I ever see that didn't choke on a swig of that. But you youngsters has the advantage of a sound linings for your innards." He helped himself from the flask, coughed heavily, and then pounded home the cork. "How's things up Whiteacre way?" "Fair to middlin'," said Jig. "They ain't hollerin' for rain so much as they was." "I reckon not," agreed the rancher. "And how's things down Sour Creek way?" asked Jig. "Trouble bustin' every minute," said the other. "Murder, gun scrapes, brawls in the hotel, to beat anything I ever see. The town is sure going plumb to the dogs at this rate." "You don't say. Well, I heard something about a gent named Quade being plugged." "Him? He was just the beginning, just the start. Since then, we had a man took away from old Kern, which don't happen once in a coon age. Then we had a fine fresh of murders right this morning, and the present minute they's two in jail on murder charges, and both are sure to swing." Jig gasped. "Two?" she exclaimed. "Yep. They was a skinny schoolteacher named, I forgot what. Most general he was called Cold Feet, which fitted. They thought he killed Quade on account of a girl. But a gent named Sinclair up and confessed, and he is waiting for the rope. And then a sheriff, all by himself, grabbed Arizona for the murder of Sanderson. Oh, times is picking up considerable in Sour Creek. Reminds me of 20 years back, before Kern come on the job and cleaned up the gunfighters." "Two murders?" repeated the girl faintly. "And has Arizona confessed too?" "Not him, but the sheriff has enough to give him a hard run. I've got to be drifting on, son. Take my advice and head straight for Woodville. You lack 5 years of being old enough for Sour Creek these days." He called his farewell, threw off the brake, and cursed the span of horses into their former trot. As for Jig, she waited until the scent of alkali dust died away and the rattle of the buckboard was faint in the distance. Then she turned her horse back toward Sour Creek and urged it to a steady gallop bouncing in the saddle. There seemed a fatality about her. On her account, Sinclair had thrown his life in peril, and now Arizona was caught and held in the same danger. Enough of sacrifices for her. Her mind was firm to repay some of these services at any cost, and she had thought of a way. With that gloomy purpose before her, her ordinary timidity disappeared. It was strange to ride into Sour Creek, and she passed in review among the rough men of the town, constantly fearful that they might pierce her disguise. She had trained herself to a long stride and a swaggering demeanor, and by constant practice she had been able to lower the pitch of her voice and roughen its quality. Yet in spite of the constant practice, she never had been able to gain absolute self-confidence. Tonight, however, there was no fear in her. She went straight to the hotel, through the reins, and walked boldly through the door into a cluster of men. They yelled at the sight of her. "Jiggs, by guns, he's come in. Say, kid, the sheriff's been looking for you." They swerved around her, grinning good-naturedly. When a person has been almost lynched for a crime another has committed, he gains a certain standing, no matter what may be the public opinion of his courage. The schoolteacher had become a personage, but Jig met their smiles with a level eye. "If the sheriff's looking for me," she said, "tell him I have a room in the hotel. He can find me here." Pop shook hands before he shoved the register toward her. "My kids will sure be glad to see you safe back," he said. "And I'm glad too, Jig." Nodding, she turned to sign her name in the bold, free hand which she had cultivated. She could feel the crowd staring behind her, and she could hear their murmurs. But she was not nervous. It seemed that all apprehension had left her. "Where's Cartwright?" she asked. "Sitting in a game of poker." "Hello, buddy," she called to a red-headed youngster. "Go in and tell Cartwright that I'm waiting for him in my room, will you?" "Ain't no use," said Pop, staring at this new and more masculine Jig. "Cartwright is all heated up about the game, and he's lost enough to get anybody excited. He won't come. Better go in there if you want to see him." "I'll try my luck this way," said Jig coldly. "Run along, Buddy." Buddy obeyed, and Jig went up the stairs to her room. "What's come over him?" asked the crowd, the moment Cold Feet was out of sight. "Looks like he growed up in a day." "He's gone through enough to make a man out of him," answered Pop. "Never can tell how a kid will turn out." But in her room, Jig had sunk into a chair, dropped her elbows on the table, and buried her face in her hands, trying to steady her thoughts. She heard the heavy pounding of feet on the stairs, a strong tread in the hall that made the flooring of the old building quiver, and then the door was flung open, slammed shut, and the key turned in the lock. Cartwright set his shoulders against the door, as though he feared she would try to rush past him. He stared at her with a queer mixture of fear, rage, and astonishment. "So I've got you at last, huh? I got you after all this." Curiously, she stared at him. She had dreaded the interview, but now that he was before her, she was surprised to find that she felt no fear. She examined him as if from a distance. "Yes," she admitted, "you have me. Will you sit down?" "I need room to talk," he said, swaggering to the table. He struck his fist on it. "Now, to start with, what in thunder did you mean by running away?" "We're leaving the past to bury the past," she said. "That's the first concession you have to make." He laughed, his laughter ending with a choked sound. "And why should I make concessions?" Jiggs watched the veins of fury swell in his forehead, watched calmly, and then threw her sombrero on the bed and smoothed back her hair, still watching without a change of expression. It seemed as if her calm acted to sober him, and the passing of her hand across the bright silken hair all at once softened him. He sank into the opposite chair, leaning far across the table toward her. Honey, take you all in all, you're prettier right here in this man's outfit that I ever see you. A pile prettier." For a moment she closed her eyes. The sacrifice which she intended was becoming harder, desperately hard to make. "I'm going to take you back and forgive you," said Cartwright, apparently blind to what was going on in her mind. "I ain't one to carry malice. You keep to the line from now on and we'll get along fine. But you step crooked just once more and I'll learn you a pile of things you never even dreamed could happen." To her it seemed that he stood in a shaft of consuming light that exposed every shadowy nook and cranny of his nature, and the narrow-minded meanness that she saw startled her. "What you do afterward with me is your own affair," she said. "It's about the present that I've come to bargain." "Bargain?" "Exactly. Do what I ask, and I go back and act as your wife. If you refuse, I walk out of your life forever." He could not speak for a moment. Then he exploded. "It's funny. I could almost laugh hearing you chatter crazy like this. Don't you think I've got a right to make my own wife come home with me, now that I've found her? Wouldn't the law stand behind me?" "You can force me to come," she admitted quietly. "But if you do, I'll let the whole truth be known that I ran away from you. Can your pride stand that, Jude?" He writhed. "And how you'll get around that, even if I don't make you, and you come back of your own free will." "Somehow I'll manage. I'll find a story of how I was carried away by half a dozen men who had come to loot the upper rooms of the house, while the wedding party was downstairs. I'll find a story that will wash." "Yes, I think you will," said Cartwright, breathing heavily. "I sure think you will. You was always a clever little devil, I know. But a bargain? I ought to—" He checked himself. "But I'm through with the black talk. When I get you back on the ranch, I'll show you that you can be happy up there. And now when you get over your fool notions, you'll be a wife to be proud of. Now, honey, tell me what you want." "I want you to save the lives of two men. They're both in jail on my account. And they're both charged with murder. You know who I mean." Cartwright rose out of his chair. "Sinclair," he groaned. "Curse him. Sinclair again, huh? What's they between you two?" Her answer smothered his fury again. It was pain that was giving her strength. "Jude, if you really want me to go back with you, don't ask that question. He has treated me as an honorable man always treats a woman. He tried to serve me." "Serve you? By coming here trying to kill me?" "He may have thought I wished to be free. He didn't tell me what he was going to do." "That's a lie." He stopped, watching her white face. "I don't mean that, you know. But you ain't actually asking me to get Sinclair out of jail. Besides, I couldn't do it." "You could easily. Moreover, it is to your interest. It will take a strong jail to hold him, and if he breaks away, you know that he's a dangerous man. He hates you, Jude, and he might try to find you. If he did." She waved her hand, and Cartwright followed the gesture with great fascinated eyes, as if he saw himself dissolving into thin air. "I know he's a desperado right enough, the Sinclair. Ain't I seen him work?" He shuddered at the memory. "But get him out of jail, Jude, and that will be ended. He'll be your friend." "Could I trust him?" "Don't you think Riley Sinclair is a man to be trusted?" "I don't know." He lowered his eyes. "Maybe he is." "As for Arizona," she went on, "the same thing holds for him." "Yes, if I could get one out, I could get two. But how can I do it? This Sheriff Kern is a fighting idiot and loves a gunplay. Ain't no man killer, honey." "But you're rich, Jude." "Tolerable. There may be one or two has more than me around these parts." "And money buys men." "Don't it, though?" said Jude, expanding. "Why, when they found out that I was a spender, they started in hounding me. One gent wanted me to help him on a mortgage, Only $50 to meet a payment. And they's half a dozen would mortgage their souls if I'd stake 'em to enough downstairs to get 'em into a crap game or something. Then let them have the money they need. Why, it wouldn't be more than $100 altogether. 100 is 100. Why should I throw it away on them bums? Because after you've done it, you'll have a dozen men who'll follow you. You'll have a mob. Sure, but what of that? Expect me to lead an attack on a jail, huh? Throw my life away. By guns, I think you'd like that. You don't have to lead. Just give them the money they need, and then spread the word around that Riley Sinclair is really an honorable man who killed Quade in a fair fight. I know what they thought of Quade. He was a bully. No one liked him. Tell them it's a shame that a man like Sinclair should die because he killed a big, hulking cur such as Quade. They'll listen, particularly if they have your money. I know these men, Jude. If they think an injustice is being done, they'll risk their necks to right it. And if you work on them in the right way, you can have 20 men who'll risk everything to get Riley out. But there won't be a risk. If 20 men rush the jail, the guards will simply throw down their guns and give up. Well, I wonder, muttered Cartwright. I'm sure of it, Jude. Do you think a deputy will let himself be killed simply to keep a prisoner safely? They won't do it. You don't know this Kern. I do know him, and I know that he's human. I've seen him beaten once already. By Sinclair. You keep coming back to him. Jude, if you do this thing for me, she said steadily, I'll go back with you. I don't love you, but if I go back, I'll keep you from a great deal of shameful talk. I'm sorry, truly, that I left. I couldn't help it. It was an impulse that took me by the throat. And if I go back, I'll honestly try to make you a good wife. She faltered a little before that last word, and her voice fell. But Jude Cartwright was wholly fascinated by the color in her face, and the softness of her voice he mistook for a sudden rise of tenderness. There's only one thing I got to ask, you and Sinclair. Have you ever told him you're pretty fond of him? That you love him? He blurted it out, stammering. Certainly she knew that her answer was a lie, though it was true in the letter. I never told him so, she said firmly, but I owe him a great debt. He must not die because he's a gentleman, Jude. All the time she was speaking, he watched her with ferret sharpness, thinking busily. Before she ended, he had reached his decision. I'm going to raise that mob. Jude? What a ring in her voice. If he had been in doubt, he would have known then. No matter what she said, she loved Riley Sinclair. He smiled sourly down on her. Keep your thanks. You'll hear news of Sinclair before morning. And he stalked out of the room. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cartwright went downstairs in the highest good humor. He had been convinced of two things in the interview with his wife. The first was that she could be induced to return to him. The second was that she loved Riley Sinclair. He did not hate her for such fickleness. He merely despised her for her lack of brains. No thinking woman could hesitate a moment between the ranches and the lumber tracts of Cartwright and the empty purse of Riley Sinclair. As for hatred, that he concentrated on the head of Sinclair himself. He had already excellent reasons for hating the rangy cowpuncher. Those reasons were now intensified and given weight by what he had recently learned. He determined to raise a mob, but not to accomplish his wife's desires. What she had said about the weakness of jails, the strength of Sinclair, and the probability that once out he would take the trail of the rancher appealed vigorously to his imagination. He did not dream that such a man as Sinclair would hesitate at a killing. And loving the girl, the first thing Sinclair would do would be to remove the obstacle through the simple expedient of a well-placed bullet. But the girl had not only convinced him in this direction, she had taught him where his strength lay, and she had pointed a novel use for that strength. He went to work instantly when he entered the big back room of the hotel, which was used for cards and surreptitious drinking. A little, patient-faced man in a corner, who had been sucking a pipe all evening and watching the crap game hungrily, was the first object of his charity. $10 slipped into the pocket of the little cowpuncher brought him out of his chair with a grin of gratitude and bewilderment. A moment later, he was on his knees calling to the dice in a crackling voice. Crossing the room, Cartwright picked out two more obviously stalled gamblers and gave them a new start. Returning to the table, he found that the game was lagging. In the first place, he had from the start supplied most of the sinews of war to that game. Also, two disgruntled members had gone broke in his absence. Through trying to plunge for the spoils of the evening, they sat back with black faces and watched him come. "We're getting down to a small game," said the gray-headed man who was dealing. But Cartwright had other ideas. "A friend's a friend," he said jovially. "And a gent that's been playing beside me all evening I figure for a friend. Sit in, boys. I'll stake you to a couple of rounds, huh?" Gladly they came, astonished and exchanging glances. Cartwright had made a sour loser all the game. This sudden generosity took them off balance. It let in a merciful light upon the cruel criticism which they had been leveling at him in private. The pale man with the blond eyelashes and the faded blue eyes, who had been dexterously stacking the cards all through the game, decided at that moment that he would not only stop cheating, but he would even lose some of his ill-gotten gains back into the game. Only a sudden rush of unbelievable luck kept him from executing his generous and silent promise. This pale-faced man was named Whitey, from the excessive blondness of his hair and his pallor. He was not popular in Sour Creek, but he was much respected. A proof of his ingenuity was that he had cheated at cards in that community for 5 years, and still he had never been caught at his work. He was not a bold-talking man. In fact, he never started arguments or trouble of any kind. But he was a most dexterous and thoroughgoing fighter when he was cornered. In fact, he was what is known widely as a finisher. And it was Whitey whom Cartwright had chosen as the leader of the mob which he intended raising. He waited until the first shuffle was in progress after the hand. Then he began his theme. "Understand the sheriff is pretty strong for this Sinclair that murdered Quade," he said carelessly. "Murder is a tolerable strong word," came back the unfriendly answer. "Maybe it was a fair fight." Cartwright laughed. "Maybe it was," he said. Whitey interrupted himself in the act of shoving the pack across to be cut. He raised his pale eyes to the face of the rancher. "What makes you laugh, Cartwright?" "Nothing," said Jude hastily. "Nothing at all. If you gents don't know Sinclair, it ain't up to me to give you light. Let him go." Nothing more was said during that hand which Whitey won. Jude, apparently bluffing shamelessly, bucked him up to $50, and then he allowed himself to be called with a pair of tens against a full house. Not only did he lose, but he started a laugh against himself, and he joined in cheerfully. He was aware of Whitey frowning curiously at him and smiling faintly, which was the nearest that Whitey ever came to laughter. And indeed, the laugh cost Cartwright more than money, but it was a price the price he was paying for the adherence of Whitey. "What about the Sinclair?" asked the man with the great red blotchy freckles across his face and the back of his neck, so that the skin between looked red and raw. "You come from up north, which is his direction, too. Know anything about him? He looks like pretty much of a man to me, and the sheriff says he's a square shooter from the word go." "Maybe he is," said Cartwright, "but I don't want to go around digging the ground away from nobody's reputation." "Whatever he's got, he won't last long," said Whitey definitely. "He'll swing sure." It was Cartwright's opening. He took advantage of it dexterously, without too much haste. He even yawned to show his lack of interest. "Well, I got 100 that says he don't hang," he observed quietly, and looked full at Whitey across the table. It was a challenge which the gambling spirit of the latter could not afford to overlook. "Money talks," began Whitey. Then he checked himself. "Do you know anything, Cartwright?" "Sure I don't," said Jude, in the manner of one who has abundant knowledge in reserve. "But they say that the sheriff and Sinclair have become regular bunkies. Don't do nothing hardly but sit and chin with each other over in the jail. Ever known Kern to do that before?" They shook their heads. "Which is a sign that Sinclair may be all right," said the sober Whitey. "Which is a sign that he might have something on the sheriff," said Jude Cartwright. "I don't say that he has, mind you, but it looks kind of queer. He yanked a prisoner away from the sheriff one day, and the next day he's took for murder. Did the sheriff have much to do with his taking? No, he didn't. By all accounts, it was Arizona that done the taking, planning, and everything. And after Sinclair is took, what does the sheriff do? He gets on the trail of Arizona and has him checked in for murder of another gent. Maybe Arizona is guilty, maybe he ain't. But it kind of looks as if they was something between Sinclair and Kern, don't it?" At this bold exposition of possibilities they paused. "Kern is figured tolerable straight," declared Whitey. "Sure he is. That's because he don't talk none and does his work. Besides, he's a killer. That's his job. So is Sinclair a killer. Maybe he did fight Quade square, but Quade ain't the only one. Why, boys, the Sinclair has got a record as long as my arm." In silence they sat around the table, each man thinking hard. The professional gunman gets scant sympathy from ordinary cowpunchers. "Now I dropped in at the jail," said the man of the great freckles, "and come to think about it, I heard Sinclair singing, and I seen him polishing his spurs." "Sure, he's getting ready for a ride," put in Cartwright. There was a growl from the others. They were slowly turning their interest from the game to Cartwright. "What do you mean, a ride?" "Got another 100," said Cartwright calmly, "that when the morning comes it won't find Sinclair in the jail." At once they were absolutely silenced, for money talks in an eloquent voice. Deliberately Cartwright counted out the 2 stacks of shimmering $20 gold pieces, 5 to a stack. 100 that he don't hang, and another 100 that he ain't in the jail when the morning comes. Any takers, boys? It ought to be easy money if everything's square." Whitey made a move, but finally merely raised his hand and rubbed his chin. He was watching that gold on the table with cat-like interest. A man must know something to be so sure. "I'd like to know," murmured the man of the freckles disconnectedly. "Well," said Cartwright, "there ain't much of a mystery about it. For one thing, if the sheriff was plumb set on keeping them 2, why didn't he take 'em over to Woodville today, where there's a jail they couldn't bust out of, eh?" Again they were silenced, and in an argument, when a man falls silent, it simply means that he is thinking hard on the other side. "But as far as I'm concerned," went on Cartwright, yawning again, "it don't make no difference one way or another. Sour Creek ain't my town, and I don't care if it gets the ha-ha for having his jail busted open. Of course, after the birds have flown, the sheriff will ride hard after 'em on the wrong trail." Whitey raised his slender, agile, efficient hand. "Gents," he said, "something has got to be done. This man Cartwright is giving us the truth. He's got his hunch, and hunches is mostly always right." "Speak out, Whitey," said the man with the freckles encouragingly. "I like your style of thinking." Nodding his acknowledgments, Whitey said, "The main thing seems to be that Sinclair and Arizona is old hands at killing, and they had ought to be hung. Well, if the sheriff ain't got the rope, maybe we could help him out, huh?" End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The moment her husband was gone, Jig dropped back in her chair and buried her face in her arms, weeping. But there is a sort of sad happiness in making sacrifices for those we love, and presently Jig was laughing through her tears and trembling as she wiped the tears away. After a time she was able to make herself ready for another appearance in the street of Sour Creek. She practiced back and forth in her room that exaggerated swagger, jerked her sombrero rakishly over one eye, cocked up her cartridge belt at one side, and swung down the stairs. She went straight to the jail and met the sheriff at the door, where he sat smoking a stub of a pipe. He gaped widely at the sight of her, smoke streaming up past his eyes. Then he rose and shook hands violently. "All I got to say, Jig," he remarked, "is that the others was the ones that made the big mistake. When I went and arrested you, I was just following in line, but I'm sorry, and I'm mighty glad that you've been found to be okay." Wanly she smiled and thanked him for his good wishes. "I'd like to see Sinclair," she said. Kern's amiability increased. "The best thing I know about you, Jig, is that you ain't turning Sinclair down, now that he's in trouble. Go right back in the jail. Him and Arizona is chinning. Wait a minute. I guess I got to keep an eye on you to see you don't pass nothing through the bars. Keep clean back from them bars, Jig, and then you can talk all you want. I'll stay here where I can watch you, but can't hear. Is that square?" "Nothing squarer in the world," said Jig, and went in. She left the sheriff grinning vacantly into the dark. There was a peculiar something in Jig's smile that softened men. But when she stepped into the sphere of the lantern light that spread faintly through the cell, she was astonished to see Arizona and Sinclair kneeling opposite each other, shooting dice with abandon and snapping of the fingers. They rose, laughing at the sight of her, and came to the bars. "But you aren't worried?" asked Jig. "You aren't upset by all this?" It was Arizona who answered, a strangely changed Arizona since his entrance into the jail. "Look here," he said gaily, "why should we be worrying? Ain't we got a good sound roof over our heads, with a set of blankets to sleep in?" He smiled at tall Sinclair, then changed his voice. "Things fell through," he said softly, glancing at the far-off shadowy figure of the sheriff. "Sorry, but we'll work this out yet." "I know," she answered. She lowered her voice to caution. "I'm only going to stay a moment to keep away suspicions. Listen, something is going to happen tonight that will set you both free. Don't ask me what it is, but among those cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop, I'm going to have 2 good horses saddled and ready for you. One will be your roan, Arizona, and I'll have a good horse for you, Riley. And when you're free, start for those horses." Sinclair laid hold on the bars with his big hands and pressed his face close to the iron, staring at her. "You ain't coming along with us?" he asked. "I? No." "Are you going to stay here?" "Perhaps. I don't know. I haven't made up my mind. Has Cartwright? She broke away from those entangling questions. I must go. But you'll be at the place with the horses? Yes. Then so long till the time comes. And you're a brick, Jig. Once outside the jail, she set to work at once. As for getting the roan, it was the simplest thing in the world. There was no one in the stable behind the hotel, and no one to ask questions. She calmly saddled the roan, mounted him, and rode by a wider detour to the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop. Her own horse was to be for Sinclair, but before she took him, she went into the hotel, and the first man she found on the veranda was Cartwright. He came to her at once, shifting away from the others. "How are things?" "Good," said Cartwright. "Ain't you heard 'em talking?" Here and there about the hotel, men stood in knots of 3 or 4, talking in low voices. "Are they talking about that?" "Sure they are," said Cartwright, relieved. "You ain't heard nothing?" "Not a word." "Then the thing for you to do is to keep under cover. You don't want to get mixed up in this thing, eh?" "I suppose not." "Keep out of sight, honey. The crowd will start pretty soon and tear things loose." He could not resist one savage thrust. "A rope or a pair of ropes will do the work." "Ropes?" "One to tie Kern and the other to tie his deputy," he exclaimed smoothly. "Where are you going now?" "Getting their retreat ready," she whispered excitedly. "I've already warned them where to go to get the horses." She waved to him and stepped back into the night, convinced that all was well. As for Cartwright, he hesitated, staring after her. After all, if his plan developed, it would be wise for him to allow the others to do the work of mischief. He had no wish to be actively mixed up with a lynching party. Sometimes there were after results, and if he had done no more than talk, there would be small hold upon him by the law. Moreover, things were going smoothly under the guidance of Whitey. The pale-faced man had thrown himself body and soul into the movement. It was a rare thing to see Whitey excited. Other men were readily impressed. After a time, when anger had reached a certain point where men melt into hot action, these fixed figures of men would sweep into fluid action, and then the fates of Arizona and Sinclair would be determined. It pleased Cartwright more than any action of his life to feel that he had stirred up this movement. It pleased him still more to know that he could now step back and watch the work of ruin go on. It was like disturbing the one small stone which starts the avalanche, which eventually smashes the far-off forest. So much was done then, and now why not make sure that the very last means of retreat for the pair was blocked? The girl went to get the horses, and if, by the 1 chance in 20, the two should actually break out of the jail, it would remain to Cartwright to kill the horses or the men. He did not care which. He slipped behind the hotel and presently saw the girl come out of the stable with her horse. He followed, skulking softly behind her until he reached the appointed place among the cottonwoods. The trees grew tall and thick of trunk, and about their bases was a growth of dense shrubbery. It was a simple thing to conceal 2 saddled horses in a hollow which sank into the edge of the shrubbery. Cartwright's first desire was to couch himself in shooting distance. Then he remembered that shooting with a revolver by moonlight was uncertain work. He slipped away to the hotel and got a rifle ready enough. Men were milling through the lower rooms of the hotel. The point of discussion had long since been passed. The ringleaders had made up their minds. They went about with faces so black that those who were asked to join hardly had the courage to question. There was broad-voiced rumor growing swiftly. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. It was like that mysterious whisper which goes through the forest before the heavy storm strikes. Something was terribly wrong and must be righted. How the ringleaders had reasoned, nobody paused to ask. It was sufficient that a score of men were saying. The sheriff figures on letting Sinclair and Arizona go. A typical scene between two men. They meet casually, one man whistling, the other thoughtful. "What's the bad luck?" asks the whistler. "No time for whistling," says the other. "Say, what do you mean?" "I ask you just this," said the gloomy man, with a mystery of much knowledge in his face. "Are gents around here going to be murdered, and the murderers go free?" "Well?" "Sinclair and Arizona, that's what's up. They're going to bust loose." "I don't know about Arizona, but Sinclair, they say, is a square shooter." "Who told you that? Sinclair himself? He's got a rep as long as my arm. He's a bad one, son." "You don't say?" "I do say. And something has got to be done, or Sour Creek won't be a decent man's town no more. Let me in." Off they went, arm in arm. Cartwright saw half a dozen little interviews of this nature as he entered the hotel. Men were excited, they hardly knew why. There is no need for reason in a mob. One has only to cry "kill," and the mob will start of its own volition to find something that may be slain. Also, a mob has no conscience and no remorse. It is the nearest thing to a devil that exists, and it is also the nearest thing to the divine mercy and courage. It is braver than the bravest man. It is more timorous than the most fearful. It is fiercer than a lion, gentler than a lamb. All these things by turn, and each one to the exclusion of all the others. Now the thunderclouds were piling on the horizon, and Cartwright could feel the electricity in the air. He went to Pop. "I gotta have a rifle." "What for?" "You know," said Cartwright significantly. The hotel keeper nodded. He brought out an old Winchester, still mobile, of action and deadly. With that weapon under his arm, Cartwright started back, but then he remembered that there were excellent chances of missing even with a rifle, when he was shooting through the shadows and by the treacherous moonlight. It would be better, far better, to have his horse with him. Then, if he actually succeeded in wounding one or both of them, he could run his victim down, or perhaps keep up a steady fire of rifle shots from the rear that would bring half the town pouring out to join in the chase. So he swung back to the stables, saddled his horse, trotted it around in a comfortably wide detour, and coming within sound distance of the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop, he dismounted and led his horse into a dense growth of shrubbery. That close approach would have been impossible without alarming the girl, had it not been for a stiff wind blowing across into his face, completely muffling the noise of his coming. In the bushes he ensconced himself safely. Only a few yards away he kept his eye on the opening among the cottonwoods, behind which the girl and the two horses moved from time to time, growing more and more visible as the moon climbed above the horizon mist. He tightened his grip on the rifle and amused himself with drawing beads on stumps and bright bits of foliage. From time to time he must be ready for any sort of action if the two should ever appear. While he waited, sounds reached his ear from the town, sounds eloquent of purpose. He listened to them as to beautiful music. It was a low, distinct, and continuous humming sound. Voices of men went into it, low as the growl of an angered dog, and there was a background of slamming doors and footsteps on verandas. Sour Creek was mustering for the assault. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Now that sound had entered the jail, and it had a peculiar effect. It was like that distant murmuring of the storm which walks over the treetops far away. It made the sheriff and his two prisoners lift their heads and look at one another in silence. For the sheriff was most unprofessionally tilted back in a chair, with his feet braced against the bars of the cell, while he chatted with his bad men about men, women, and events. The sheriff had a distinct curiosity to learn how Arizona had recovered so suddenly from his blue funk. Unquestionably, the fat man had recovered. His voice was as steady now as any man's, and the old insolent glitter was in his eyes. He squared his shoulders and blew his smoke straight at the face of the sheriff as he talked. What caused it, the sheriff could not tell. This rehabilitation of a fighting man. But he connected the influence of Sinclair with the change. By this time Sinclair himself was the more restless of the two. While Arizona sat on ease on the bunk, the tall man ranged up and down the cell with long, noiseless steps, turning quickly back and forth besides the bars. He had spent his nervous energy cheering up Arizona, until the latter was filled with a reckless, careless courage. What would happen Arizona could not guess, but Sinclair had assured him that something would happen, and he trusted implicitly to the word of his tall companion. Sooner or later he would learn that they were hopeless, and Sinclair dreaded the breakdown which he knew would follow that discovery. In his heart, Sinclair knew that there would be no hope, no chance. The girl, he felt, had been swept off her feet with some absurd dream of freeing them. For his own part, he had implicit faith in the strength of the tool-proof steel of the bars, on the one hand, and the gun of the sheriff on the other. As long as they held, they would keep their prisoners. The key to freedom was the key to the sheriff's heart, and Sinclair was too much of a man to whine. He had come to the end of his trail, and that was evident in the restlessness of his walking to and fro. The love of the one thing on earth that he cared for was his, according to Arizona, and there was nothing to make the fat man lie. It seemed to Riley Sinclair that, at the very moment he had set his hands upon priceless gold, the treasure was crumbling to dead sand. He had lost her by the very thing that won her. In the midst of his pacing he stopped and lifted his head, just as the sheriff and Arizona did the same thing. The far-off murmur hummed and moaned toward them, gathering strength. Then the sheriff pushed back his chair and went to the front of the jail. They heard him give directions to his deputy to find out what the murmuring meant. When Kern returned, he was patently worried. "Gents," he said, "I've heard that same sort of sound twice before, and it means business." None of the three spoke again until the door of the jail was burst open and the deputy came on them, running. "Kern," he gasped as he reached the sheriff. "They're coming." "Who?" "Every man in Sour Creek. They tried to get me with 'em. I told 'em I'd stay, and then slipped off. They want both of these. They want 'em bad. They're going to fight to get 'em." "Do they want to grab Arizona and Sinclair?" asked the sheriff, with surprising lack of emotion. "Don't think they're guilty?" "You're wrong. They think they're sure guilty, and they're going to lynch 'em." He whispered this, but his panting made the words louder than he thought. Sinclair heard, and by the shudder of Arizona, he knew that his companion had heard as well. Now came the low-pitched voice of the sheriff. "Are you with me, Pat?" The deputy receded. "Why, man, you ain't going to fight the whole town." "I'd fight the whole town," said the sheriff smoothly, "but I don't need you with me. You're through, partner. Close the door soft when you go out." Pat made no argument, offering no sentimental protest of devotion. He was glad of any excuse, and he retreated at once. After him went the sheriff, and Sinclair heard the heavy door of the jail locked. Kern came back carrying a bundle. Outside, the murmuring had increased at a single leap to a roar. The rush for the jail was beginning. Arizona shrank back against the wall, his little eyes glaring desperately at Sinclair. his last hope in the emergency. But Sinclair looked to the sheriff. The bundle in the arms of the latter unrolled and showed 2 cartridge belts with guns appended. Next, still in silence, the sheriff unlocked the door to the cell. Sinclair? The tall cowpuncher leaped beside him. Arizona skirted away to one side stealthily. "None of that," commanded Kern. "No crooked work, Arizona. I'm giving you a fighting chance for your lives." He tossed a gun and a belt to Sinclair. The latter, without a word, buckled it on. "Now, quick work, boys," said the sheriff. "It's going to be the second time in my life that prisoners have got away and tied me up. Understand? There ain't going to be no massacre if I can help it. Gents like Sinclair don't come in pairs, and he's going to have a fighting chance. Boys, tie me up fast and throw me in the corner. I'll tell him that you slugged me through the bars and got the keys away. You hear?" As he spoke, he threw Arizona a gun and a belt, and the latter imitated Sinclair in buckling it on. But the fat man then made for the door of the cell. Outside, the rush reached the entrance to the jail and split on it. The voices leaped into a tumult. "By thunder," demanded Arizona, "are you going to wait for that?" "You want Kern to get into trouble?" asked Sinclair. "Grab this end and tie his ankles while I fix his hands." Frantically, they worked together. "Are you comfortable, Sheriff?" He lay securely trussed in a corner of the passageway. "Dead easy, boys. Now, what's your plan?" "Is there a back way out?" "No way in or out but the front door. But you got to wait till they smash it. There, they start now. Then dive out as they rush. They won't be expecting nothing like that. But gag me first." Hastily, Sinclair obeyed. The door of the jail was shaking and groaning under the attack from without, and the shouts were a steady roar. Then he hurried to the front of the little building. Arizona was already there, gun in hand, watching the door bulge under the impact. Evidently, they had caught up a heavy timber, and a dozen men were pounding it against the massive door. Sinclair caught the gun arm of his companion. "Fatty," he said hastily, "gunplay will spoil everything. We've got to take 'em by surprise. Fast running will save us, maybe. Fast shooting ain't any good when it's 1 man against 50, and these boys mean business." Arizona reluctantly let his gun drop back into its holster. He nodded to Sinclair. The latter gave his directions swiftly, speaking loudly to make his voice carry over the roar of the crowd. "When the door goes down, which it'll do pretty pronto, I'll dive out from this side, and you run from the other side, straight into the crowd. I'll turn to the right, and you turn to the left. The minute you're around the corner of the building, shoot back over your shoulder or straight into the air. It'll make 'em think that you've stopped and are going to fight 'em off from the corner. They'll take it slow, you can bet, then beat it straight on for the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith's shop. They'll drop us the minute we show. Sure, we got the long chance and nothing more. Is that good enough for you?" He was rewarded in the dimness by a glint in the eyes of Arizona, and then the fat man gripped his hand. "You and me against the world." In the meantime, the door was bulging in the center under the blows of increasing weight. A second battering ram was now brought into play, and the rain of blows was unceasing. Still between the shocks, the door sprang back, but there was a telltale rattle at every blow. Finally, as a yell sprang up from the crowd at the sight, the upper hinge snapped loudly, and the door sagged in. Both timbers were now apparently swung at the same moment. Under the joint impact, the door was literally lifted from its last hinge and hurled inward, and with it lunged the 2 battering rams and the men who had wielded them. They tumbled headlong, carried away by the very weight of their successful blow. "Now," called Sinclair, and he sprang with an Indian yell over the heads of the sprawling men in the doorway and into the thick of the crowd. Half a dozen of the drawn guns whipped up at the sight, but no one could make sure in the half-light of the identity of the man who had dashed out. Their imaginations placed the two prisoners safely behind the bars inside. Before they could think twice, a second figure leaped through the doorway and passed them in the opposite direction. Then they awakened to the fact, but they awakened in confusion. A dozen shots blazed in either direction, but they were wild snapshots of men taken off balance. Two leaps took Sinclair through the thick of the astonished men before him. He came to the scattering edges and saw a man dive at him. The cowpuncher beat the butt of his gun into the latter's face and sped on, whipping around the corner of the little jail with bullets whistling after him. His own gun, as he leaped out of sight, he fired into the ground, and he heard a similar shot from the far side of the building. Those two shots, as he had predicted, checked the pursuers one vital second and kept them milling in front of the jail. Then they spilled out around the corners, each man running low, his gun ready. But Sinclair, deep in the darkness of the tree shadows behind the jail, was already out of sight. He caught a glimpse of Arizona sprinting ahead of him for dear life. They reached the cottonwoods together and were greeted by a low shout from the girl. She was running out from the shelter, dragging the horses after her. Arizona went into his saddle with a single leap. Sinclair paused to take the jump. With his hand on the pommel, and as he lifted himself up with a jump, a gun blazed in point-blank range from the nearest shrubbery. There was a yell from Arizona, not of pain, but of rage. They saw his gun glisten in his hand, and swerving his horse to disturb the aim of the marksman, his weapon's first report blended with the second shot from the bushes, a tongue of darting flame. Straight at the flash of a target Arizona had fired, and there was an answering yell. Out of the dark of the shrubbery a great form leaped, with a grotesque shadow beneath it on the moon-whitened ground. "Cartwright!" cried Sinclair, as the big man collapsed and became a shapeless, inanimate black heap. Straight ahead Arizona was already spurring, and Sinclair waved once to the white face of Jig, then shot after his companion, while the trees and shrubbery to their left emitted a sudden swarm of men and barking guns. But to strike a rapidly moving object with a revolver is never easy, and to strike by the moonlight is difficult indeed. A dangerous flight of slugs bored the air around the fugitives for the first 100 yards of their flight, but after that the firing ceased as the men of Sour Creek ran for their horses. Straight on into the night rode the pair. 1 year had made Arizona a little plumper, and 1 year had drawn Riley Sinclair more lean and somber. When they rode out on the shoulder of a flat-topped mountain and looked down into the hollow, where the late afternoon sun was already sending broad shadows out from every rise of ground, Sour Creek was a blur and a twinkle of glass in the distance. "Come to think of it," said Arizona, "it was just 1 year today, Riley. Was it that brung you back here, and me unknowing?" The tall man made no answer, but shaded his eyes to peer down into the valley, and Arizona made no attempt to pursue the conversation. He was long since accustomed to the silences of his traveling mate. Seeing that Sinclair showed no disposition either to speak or move, he left the big cowpuncher to himself and started off through the trees in search of game. The sign of a deer caught his eye and hurried him on into a futile chase, from which he returned in the early dark of the evening. He was guided by the fire which Sinclair had kindled on the shoulder, but to his surprise, as he drew nearer, the fire dwindled, very much as if Riley had entirely forgotten to replenish it with dry wood. A year of wild life had sharpened the caution of Arizona. That neglect of his fire was by no means in keeping with the usual methods of Sinclair. Before he came to the last spur of the hill, Arizona dismounted and stole up on foot, He listened intently. There was not a sound of anyone moving about. There was only an occasional crackle of the dying fire. When he came to the edge of the shoulder, Arizona raised his head cautiously to peer over. He saw a faintly illumined picture of Riley Sinclair, sitting with his hat off, his face raised, and such a light in his face that there needed no play of the fire to tell its meaning. Beside him sat a girl, more distinct, for she was dressed in white, and the fire gleamed and curled and mottled her hair, and cast a highlight on her chin, her throat, and her hand in the brown hand of Sinclair. Arizona winced down out of sight and stole back under the trees. "Doggone me," he said to his horse. They both remembered the day. End of chapter 35. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand.